Chapter 33, Act 33, The Crystal's Tale. Act 33, The Crystal's Tale, The Reborn.
And what the hell do you think you're doing?
Golbez flinched as Edge's gravelly shout filled the bridge, wondering what he had possibly done in the last 5 minutes that would have pissed Edge off again, other than existing. When he looked up from the static-plagued radar he had been investigating, he saw the Evelyn 4 standing in the entryway to the bridge, the apparent target of Edge's ire. They had been the last of the Falcon's former passengers to board the ship. He had forced himself to prepare the lunar whale for takeoff while the others had come aboard. Since time was of the essence, and Theodore would not be of any use, he was still despondently draped over Cecil's pod, as dead to the world as his father. If there had been even a sliver of doubt in the back of his mind that Edge hadn't spilled the beans about his identity to the others as soon as he and Luca had stepped off the Falcon, it was obliterated by the filthy look Palom had bestowed upon him as he limped his way onto the ship, Leonora and Porum slinking behind him, their eyes cast aside. He said nothing as Rydia quickly ushered them inside, and continued to say nothing as the others followed. The kindest, if you were to stretch the definition of that word, reaction he received was from Yang, who gave him a curt nod. Golbez could tell that Ursula, who was at her father's side, was desperate to lay her fists into something, but she kept her gaze locked straight ahead on the back of her father's head, probably meditating her way out of murderous thoughts. Despite Edge's harsh tone and the smoke that was pouring out of his ears, none of the ninjas looked particularly chastised. Golbez went back to what he was doing, his hair falling over his face like a protective barrier as he half listened in on their conversation.
We talked it over, Master,
Gekau said, his eyes even more squinted than usual thanks to the blinding lights. Golbez wondered how the heck the Evelyn 4's leader could see where he was walking, let alone fight on a regular basis.
And we've decided we're accompanying you,
Izayoi added, popping a curvy hip as she raised an eyebrow. Edge rolled his eyes, crossing his arms over his chest.
Don't try any of that seductive stuff with me, Izayoi. I thought you said you didn't want to be treated like a woman anymore. Who said I was trying anything?
Izayoi huffed.
If I were trying, you wouldn't even know it, you would be on your knees, begging for more. Whoa, this is getting a little beyond age-appropriate,
Tsukinawa groaned, covering his ears.
Besides, I don't think Master Edge's girlfriend would like any of this talk. Master Edge's what?
Rydia hissed from behind Edge, where she had been quietly lingering. She found herself reaching for her whip, eyes flashing like a python readying for the kill. Edge whirled around, his voice catching in his throat as she pressed up against him, pushing the whip into an arch with her bare hands and quickly pulling it taut, a loud crack, exploding in the air.
What kind of stories have you been telling them? And none.
Edge cried, raising his hands in the air in surrender.
Honest.
He glared back at the ninjas, who were staring at them, all with identical smirks on their faces.
The only thing I've told them is that they are not going with us to the new moon. I'm sure that as we speak, the seneschal is mere moments away from wedding himself. So book it out of here and go take the Falcon back to Evelyn, or something. Don't you dare steal my ship!
Luca shouted from the common room, and Edge reddened.
Does every woman I know have supersonic hearing? When you are talking about them, it is an ability that is guaranteed to manifest itself,
Zangetsu smiled.
But, Master, back to our discussion. There is no discussion.
Edge protested.
I already told you guys back on the Falcon, this is the outer limits. The beyond the beyond. The final frontier. What are you going on about?
Tsukinawa blinked, and Edge stomped his foot against the grates.
Are you guys even listening to me? Yes, of course,
Gekau frowned.
But would you calm that obnoxious temper of yours and listen to us, for a change?
Edge's eyes widened, and he pulled down his cowl, revealing a very confused flat line where his mouth should have been. He was either going into shock at actually being called out for his attitude by Gekau for the first time since the two of them had completed their trial together as classmates, or physically restraining himself from saying anything unkeyingly that he knew he would just end up regretting later while half drowned in a bottle of Bacchus wine. Gekau took Edge's silence as consent to continue, and jutted his thumb back toward the others, who were standing behind him, silent as shadows.
Master, we realize your intentions are to keep us safe. But it's an insult to our role in all of this, not just as your loyal servants, but as citizens of the planet itself, to refuse our request to join you. I don't know what will become of us once we reach this new moon. All I know is that I will regret every day I wake for the rest of my life, no matter how long or short that might be, if I had not least attempted to make things right. I've lived a long and fruitful life, Master,
Zangetsu bowed his head.
But alongside my greatest triumphs have also been devastating tragedies. I can't bring myself to let any more pain soak into Evelyn's roots as she continues to blossom under your reign. Losing you would be like losing Rai all over again. I've taken up arms in his stead so that his love for his home nation could live on, although I know at heart I am an unworthy vessel. Are you really willing to deny me this?
Rai. Golbez flinched when he heard the agony dripping from Zanjitsu's voice. Was that someone you lost because of me, along with Edge's parents?
Come on.
Edge frowned, shaking his head.
You and Gekao may be ancient entities willing to throw away your lives, but what about Izayoi and Tsukinawa over here? They're young and actually have something to live for. You're going to drag them into all of this. I'm the same age as you,
Gekao hissed as Izayoi snaked her arm around Tsukinawa's shoulders, pressing him gently into her side.
We made this decision together,
Izayoi said.
And it wasn't just a few minutes ago, while we were on the Falcon. It was made when we pledged ourselves to Evelyn.
Tsukinawa exclaimed.
You've given us the finest training we could have ever hoped for, Master. Now is the time to use it. Everyone else is working so hard, like Lady Porum.
He blushed a little, and Izayoi pressed a hand to her mouth to hide her smile.
I want to show the world, and this stupid moon, what Evelyn's got. It's my future, and I want to fight for it. You don't have to go at this alone anymore.
Gekao stepped forward, sweeping into a low bow.
Never again, Your Highness.
Zangetsu, Izayoi, and Tsukinawa followed suit, lowering themselves to one knee behind Gekao. Edge turned away, clutching his fists at his side as he lowered his gaze. Rydia peered up at him, silently brushing a lock of hair out of his eyes and eyeing the ghostly white of the scar slashed across his brow. Golbez crossed his arms over his chest, a grunt of protest escaping his throat before he could stop himself. The 5 ninjas looked up at him surprised, and Rydia snatched her hand back, a fierce blush racing across her cheeks.
Edge, how is what they are doing any different than what you are doing for Cecil?
Golbez asked.
Can you look them in the eyes and proclaim that you are doing this solely for Evelyn? Maybe there's a small, selfish part of you that wants to protect your friends as well, regardless of the consequences that decision delivers upon you? If that's the case, let them support your foolery and put an end to this charade. You have no right.
Edge growled, and Rydia gently smacked his cheek with 3 extended fingers, clicking her tongue.
Regardless of whether or not he has the right. Does he misspeak?
Edge swatted Rydia's hand away, throwing one last death glare at Golbez before turning back to Gekao and the others, his back teeth grinding so hard that even Golbez could hear the sickening crunch from where he was standing. It made the hair on the back of his neck stand straight up.
In case you've come down with a conveniently timed case of amnesia, allow me to remind you that as your king, my word is the law. These are my final orders to you, go home. Protect Evelyn from what is to come. Save yourselves. Master.
Izayoi began, but Edge whirled around, lowering his head as he briskly made his way back to the commons, the metal door sliding shut with a striking finality behind him. Tsukinawa let out a pitiful moan as he looked up at his elder cousin, who in turn was staring open-mouthed at Gekao. Zangetsu crossed his arms, letting out a low whistle. Gekao shook his head, offering Rydia a sad smile as he turned back the way they had come, disappearing through the threshold. Zangetsu, Izayoi, and Tsukinawa all reluctantly followed, heads hanging. Rydia thought she heard Tsukinawa mutter a quiet goodbye. But before she could say anything back, he was gone. She turned to Golbez as the door slid shut behind the Evelyn Four, her eyebrows raised. His clouded gaze met hers, daring her to say anything about his interference with Edge's little power trip. The truth was, Edge probably really had just saved his guards' lives by issuing his final mandate, but it didn't mean that Golbez agreed with his hypocrisy. Rydia opened her mouth, but paused, thinking better of whatever it was she was going to say and quickly changing the subject from what they had just witnessed.
That should be everyone. Very well,
Golbez nodded, finalizing the coordinates of their target, that shuttersome moon, with a final click of a button. The dashboard burst into a rainbow of lights, blinking in distinct patterns as a pillar of light opened below the crystal of flight, filling the room with resplendent golden beams. Rydia gazed upon it with trepidation, her mind falling back in time to when she had first journeyed on this vessel with Cecil and the others. Never in her life did she think she would be partnering with Cecil's estranged brother, and former enemy of the planet, on a strikingly similar mission years later. Golbez's voice boomed throughout the bridge, breaking the nostalgic sway the crystal's light held over her mind.
Crystal of Flight, awaken. Default overrides have been disabled. Awaiting your command, Theodore, son of Kluya.
He flinched when he heard that dreaded name spoken by the sterile, robotic voice, but didn't let his tone waver. Rydia didn't say a word, for which he was grateful.
Take us to the coordinates I've entered. Command received. Setting coordinates for the true moon. Approximate travel time is unknown. Cosmogonic interference is preventing me from calculating the route. The true moon.
Golbez and Rydia asked aloud at the same time, both turning toward each other as they spoke. For an instant, Golbez saw the crystal of flight's glare flicker a warning red in the reflection of Rydia's eyes, but when he blinked, it had disappeared, leaving Rydia staring up at him questioningly. The commons fell quiet when the door slid open, the pulsing lights that lined the dormitory hall casting the shadow of Kane's wyvern wings across the floor. As he scanned the room, he could see Porum and Ursula, who were sitting next to each other, staring up at him warily and subtly pressing into each other. On Ursula's opposite side sat Yang, his cannon-like arms crossed over his burly chest, and on Porum's opposite side sat her twin Palom, who looked as if he could spit nails on command. A sinking feeling clenched Kane's stomach as he met each of their gazes. Being that they hailed from the domains of the wind and water crystals, respectively, he had a terrible suspicion that the Dark Dragoon had left his mark on them in some capacity when he had seized the crystals. He still couldn't remember a thing, and had barely recognized any of them as it was. Harley, ever the diplomat, had been generous enough to give each person's name to Kane after she had proceeded to introduce herself. As much as his heart both ached for and feared to know the truth, there was just simply no time to rehash recent events. He had heard the engines of the lunar whale roaring to life as he had stood over Cecil and the morning sea door, which must have meant everyone had assembled and that Golbez was readying their approach to the moon. The time to come up with a plan was running short, soon they would be ripped away from the atmosphere of their planet and plunged into a new oblivion. Standing dead opposite of him across the room was Golbez and Rydia, who had entered only moments before and hadn't bothered to find a seat. They were standing a good foot apart, twin looks of concern knitted into their brows as they stared wordlessly through Kane. Rosa, who felt as if she could reach into the air and ball up the tension in her hands, it was so palpably ripe, stood from her seat. What came next made it obvious what the group had been talking about before he had walked in.
Is Cecil? No change,
Kane frowned, and Rosa's face crumpled in disappointment.
Theodore is keeping an eye on him. How could this have happened?
Ursula had pulled herself to the edge of her seat, her eyes narrowed as she barked the question. Kane knew that she directly blaming him with her words. Oh yes, he had surely done something unforgivable to her when he had acquired the wind crystal. There would be no other reason she would immediately jump to such an attitude with someone who was otherwise a stranger.
Uncle Cecil. He can't be. None of this makes sense. Uncle?
So she was close to him. She's so young, Cecil has surely been part of her life for as long as she has been alive. Something I can't say for myself any longer.
Ursula.
Yang shook his head.
Please. I'm sure they did all they could to save him. No, she is right to ask the question,
Kane sighed, and both Yang and Ursula looked up in surprise.
I'm sure you've all discussed at length the trials of these past few days, and have come to the same conclusion as I. The newest threat to the crystals infiltrated us quickly and stealthily, and they have an army of what are seemingly unlimited bodies. It's no wonder everything has happened as swiftly as it did. The mysterious girl was most likely in multiple places at once thanks to her many copies, and she had the perfect blueprint for executing her plans. Blueprint?
Edward blinked.
And what would that be? The past.
This sent a wave of murmuring throughout the room. Ursula slumped back in her seat, pressing her palm to her forehead and biting her lip. Palom jumped up, jamming his hands onto his hips.
So you're saying that everything is happening the same way as it did 17 years ago because this chick wants a repeat performance of the war? How would she even know what happened back then? She's not a human or a Lunarian, right? So what does she know about any of us? It's hard to guess how she knew manipulating Baron would get her to her goal.
Kane shook his head.
But it's undeniable what has occurred, isn't it? There are too many repeated patterns to write these events off as coincidences. And she may have been around longer than we think.
Edge crossed his legs, folding his hands behind his head.
Do you really not remember, Palom and Porum? Think hard, back to 16 years ago. Anything strange happened that seems to be repeating itself now?
Palom and Porum stared at each other quizzically for a few moments, not breathing a word. Suddenly, it was as if someone had ignited a torch behind their eyes. They let out simultaneous gasps, whirling around in their seats to face Rydia and shouting in unison.
The girl who attacked us with eidolons in the Tower of Babel. Right?
Edge nodded as Rydia grasped her arm, gazing down at the floor.
But Rydia killed her,
Palom said, and Rydia slowly shook her head.
Perhaps not. But then, what has she been doing this whole time?
Porum pressed her cheek against her palm, staring up at the ceiling in thought.
It still all feels rather sudden. And Cecil has certainly been normal only until very recently. Right, Rosa?
Yes, Rosa nodded, trying her best to swallow back the tears that were edging in at just the thought of what normalcy had once been like with Cecil and Theodore.
Normal.
Felt like a million years ago, maybe even just a long dream that had finally dovetailed into a living nightmare.
So we just have to take a page out of her book and invade her moon, eh?
Luca tapped her foot impatiently.
Find the crystals, use them to heal Cecil, and then...
A loud burst of static erupted in the bridge, causing half the room to jump. Harley looked to Edward, who had whirled around in his chair.
My lord, that sounds like... Indeed. That would be Whisperweed. Whisper what?
Leonora half-whimpered. She would feel terribly stupid if she was the only one out of the loop. As it was, it seemed that most everyone in this room had a history with each other, and she was just some random girl Palom had brought along. Palom leaned in, quickly summarizing just exactly what it was they were talking about in a hushed whisper. She still had so many questions about what exactly was going on and who all these people were, but decided to ask Palom when things were less chaotic. I hope he doesn't regret bringing me. I have to be strong, for Troya's sake.
I salvaged the flowers from Cecil's throne room before we left,
Edward explained.
I thought it might be a good way to keep tabs on what is happening back home.
He leapt up, dashing past Rydia and Golbez to enter the bridge. A few moments later, the door slid back open at his return, the king now carrying a bouquet of tall, but otherwise unremarkable flowers. Broken, choppy voices were crackling out of the blooms, and Leonora thought it sounded as if someone were shouting at her from very far away, perhaps across a canyon.
Hello? How are things down below?
Edward spoke into the bouquet. There was more static-like noise, which quickly became apparent to the observers that it was actually something else entirely, raging winds. An elderly man's voice finally managed to break through, and Harley recognized it as belonging to the Damsaian Chancellor.
The moon's advance. Severe winds. Shows no sign of.
A whistling gale sent another wave of broken audio through the blooms. Edward looked up from the bouquet, his face paling.
It's all being caused by the moon. With the crystals missing, there's nothing left to sustain the balance of the elements on our planet. Collect yourself, my friend. Stay calm, and get everyone to some place safe. We don't keep of trying to. Where? EDW. Need. OU.
There was a final ear-piercing howl of wind that sounded like a shrieking chorus of banshees, and then suddenly, the line went dead. Edward lowered the bouquet, letting out a shaky sigh.
We've lost them.
Yang shook his head.
The Whisperweed only has so much range to it, you know?
Sid frowned.
It was a nice idea, though. What could be happening down on the surface right now?
Porum muttered, and Palom shrugged.
It's the moon's gravitational pull that's driving everything crazy. The moon's gravitational pull?
Luca asked, and Palom glanced over his shoulder at her.
Everybody knows how the moon affects the tides. But it works its will on other things, too. I've heard theories that the moon can affect the hearts and minds of animals. And people, for that matter. It even affects the potency of certain types of magic. And that goes double for this moon, no doubt,
Sid added.
Just look at how enormous this thing is. With something that big so close to our planet, who could guess what'll happen down there? It may not be a matter of just being close to our planet before long,
Palom added, and Luca bit her lip, remembering how crazy the monsters had suddenly gotten in the underworld just days ago, when the moon was still a respectable distance away.
You think it'll keep on going? Like it will collide with our planet?
Yang grimaced, and Sid popped out his pipe, slowly running his tongue over his teeth.
That might be the best case scenario, now that I think about it. I thought perhaps the enemy was just trying to get close enough to make contact beyond that army of girls. More likely the moon would swallow our planet whole, given enough time. If the gravitational pull is intense enough, it could give birth to a black hole, and No.
Porum shrieked, thinking of how she had left the elder behind in his sick bed at his insistence, like he had known something like this might happen. Not like this. Elder, I didn't want to be cast out into the world only to leave you behind. Sid stuck his pipe back between his teeth, gnashing them against the clicking lacquer stormily.
We've got to get the crystals back and use them to change the moon's path. And quick.
The cabin lights abruptly dimmed to a menacing crimson, shrill alarms erupting over the ship's in-wall speakers as a powerful shudder rolled through, the sound of screaming metal being torn asunder reverberating from the depths of black space.
Aoic!
Porum screamed, tumbling out of her chair just as Pollum dove down to grab her, pulling her against him. She smiled up at him gratefully, not noticing as he reached back and discreetly snatched Leonora's hand, the Epop's eyes widening in conflicting confusion and relief.
What is it now?
Yang gasped, and Luca quickly punched a few buttons into the wall that she had discovered during her initial run-through of the ship, illuminating a monitor behind them with a blinding blast of silver light. The camera that fed the monitor appeared to be positioned at the rear of the ship upon the fluke-like stern, capturing the vibrating and crumbling bow as it was pulled ever closer toward the silver pool.
The lunar whale. Something's pulling on it. The moon is trying to gobble up our ship.
Sid cried, and another loud groan discharged, metal crunching around them like a tin can being crushed beneath one's boot.
What's going on?
Edge hissed, stumbling forward as he rose from his seat. It felt as if his clothes were made of magnets and that he was being drawn forward by an invincible force. It took everything he had just to keep his feet planted on the floor.
The moon has seized our ship.
Yang grabbed Ursula, despite her squirming protests.
We're being pulled in.
Porum whimpered against Palum's chest, and Sid and Luca took hold of each other's arms to keep their balance in the shuddering chamber.
Golbez, Luca, prepare for emergency landing.
Sid barked, and they nodded, Golbez turning to release the door to the bridge and Luca scrambling after him. Rydia pushed herself up against a wall next to the door panel, her eyes wild. Everyone else was scrambling to take cover on the floor, kicking away the furniture that wasn't bolted to the ground so that it wouldn't crush them. Even Kalka and Brino were kneeling, eyes scrunched shut as they protected their ears from the shrieking sirens that were scrambling their logic circuits.
Damn it!
Edge grunted, his eyes catching Rosa as she fled the cabin and rushed into the dorms, zooming right past a stunned Kane who had been thrown into the wall from another lurch of the ship. After a few moments, she let out a high-pitched howl, the lunar whale heaving forward dramatically and causing a cascade of chairs to smash into the northern wall, only inches away from pinning Rydia's legs.
Cecil!
Rosa's cry echoed into the commons, and Edge leapt over a huddled Edward and Harley and stopped near the door to extend his hand to Kane. The dragoon pulled himself up, both men rushing after Rosa through the dormitory as another scream greeted them, this one most definitely male. Had Theodore gotten hurt or trapped?
Now what?
Edge huffed, and Kane could only shake his head, words failing him as his lungs threatened to burst in his chest. In the dorm, Theodore and Rosa were kneeling next to Cecil's pod, clinging on for dear life as the lunar whale wrenched itself back and forth in a dizzying barrage. Cecil was flat on his back once more, but his eyes were wide open and staring into nothingness above as he thrashed about helplessly, screaming at the top of his lungs in long, raspy exhalations.
Ugh! Aye off! Ahhhhhh! Father!
Theodore cried, ducking his head as Cecil's flailing fist came flying toward him. Kane slid behind Theodore, and Edge behind Rosa, grabbing the pair's respective shoulders for balance.
Cecil!
Kane blinked, not believing what was transpiring before him. Cecil ignored his call, his hands slamming into his skull and his fingers twitching in his knotted hair as he arched his back and released another miserable wail.
God! Father!
Theodore tried to haul himself up to get closer, but his feet slipped from beneath as the ship bounced recklessly against something, sending him careening against the side of the pod and knocking him out cold with a loud thump. A streak of red erupted across his forehead as Kane knelt down to cover him, pulling the limp boy into his chest.
Cecil!
Rosa whimpered, and in response he greeted her with another blood-chilling screech that blared even louder than the ship's alarms.
It's getting worse the closer we are to the moon.
Kane trailed off, a disturbing cracking noise from above interrupting his thoughts. The last thing he saw when he glanced up was a cascade of white rushing over him, and a burst of stars erupting in his vision before his conscience drifted to the void. Golbez had given in to desperate curiosity and flicked on the monitors that recorded the dormitory activity, wanting to make sure Theodore and Cecil weren't in any immediate danger. He had given the reins of the lunar whale to Luca, commanding that the crystal of flight return them to manual controls, and she was staring intensely out the dash before her, trying her best to wrestle them out of the gravity-induced traps in which they had been ensnared once they had unknowingly pierced the moon's orbit. Golbez watched on camera as Rosa stumbled into the room, the earpiece he held against his head suddenly bursting into a chorus of familiar, agony-ridden screams that made his heart stop. Moments later, Kane and Edge appeared as well, the screams continuing to rise with each passing, tortured second. It was clear they were coming from the pod in the center of the room. Golbez could see through the screen that none of the room's other occupants had their mouths open long enough to release such terrible noises. Cecil. What are you fighting against?
Almost out.
Luca chewed on her lip in frustration, giving the virtual steering wheel within the monitor before her a final, vicious yank to the left by swiping her palm across the screen. A thunderous crash exploded in Golbez's ear, and he watched in horror as the monitor containing Cecil shorted out, gifting him with taunting black and silencing the earpiece. Unawares of what had just happened, Luca let out a whoop, running her wrist across her soaking wet forehead as she punched a few keys next to her one-handed, the crystal of flight's benign voice drifting over the loudspeakers.
Emergency brake has been activated. Emergency brake has. ZZZZZ. ZZZ. Erg.
Both Luca and Golbez turned as the crystal's voice slowed and at last died as a drawn-out, painful warble. The pillar of light that suspended the crystal in midair ignited into a leaping column of flames, the fire lapping hungrily at the crystal as a harmony of disdainful, spiritless voices filled the bridge.
Let this true moon be your eternal resting place. Though your bodies will not putrefy in the embrace of the cosmos, your treacherous souls will be judged in the nethermost depths of hell itself. What?
Luca cried.
What's wrong with the lunar whale? It's not the crystal of flight talking.
Golbez shook his head.
It's her, or rather, them. The enemy. Ha 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 ha. Birthed from the womb of a dragon's corpse. And cursed to die in one as well.
The cabin lights were snuffed out just as the lunar whale bounced across the moon's surface, sparks bursting into the air as all of the ship's monitors reverted back to plain glass, revealing a swirling sea of dust and twilight rushing before them in a chaotic blur. Golbez felt a familiar pang seize his heart before the despondent ring of shattering glass released into the universe. The last mote of light that faded from the retreating flames gifted him one final nightmare, the crystal of flight bursting into hundreds of glittering shards, raining resplendent golden light upon the bridge that faded into the ether a heartbeat later. Darkness. Light. In the end, none of it matters. I will save you from this agony. That which comes from each drawn breath leading you closer still to death. I have saved so many. Across countless galaxies. And yet, none of you hold the answers I seek. Why do you suppose that is? Theodore bolted upright, his head throbbing angrily as he released a surge of stale, sticky breath. The air that filled his lungs in turn was crisp and sterile, he had never tasted anything so clean in his life. Looking down, he found himself in a simple, metal frame bed, with white sheets stretched taut across the mattress and a white blanket pooled in his lap. To his left, an empty, steel-lined wall, to his right, a small mirror hanging over a basin and a button he assumed would let him out of here. His hand fluttered up to his forehead as his eyes adjusted to the darkness and took in his reflection. He could have sworn that he had been struck by something hard before passing out, but he couldn't remember a thing, and any evidence of a mark was gone. What shocked him more so than his miraculous recovery, however, were the twin trails of tears running down his cheeks. He had been unknowingly crying in his sleep. Reaching up to flick them away, the sad voice from his dream drifted into his ears once again.
I will save you from this agony. That which comes from each drawn breath leading you closer still to death.
What is that supposed to mean? I bet Father would know, if he were only awake. Theodore shook his head, throwing back the covers and swinging his legs over the bed. That amount of effort had been just a bit too much. He had to pause for a moment and massage his temple to ease the nausea that had crept up his throat. Yes, at some point, he must have definitely gotten hit in the head.
Ooh.
He moaned into his chest, hesitatingly testing his weight with one foot before allowing himself to properly stand. How is everyone? I have to find out what happened. As suspected, the button on the wall released the lock on his door, and he watched as it slid upward into the ceiling. He found himself in the hall of dorms that led to where his father was being kept. A quick glance at Cecil's pod revealed him to be at long last sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling steadily and his eyes shut. Theodore almost collapsed in relief. He had been terrified that the screaming that had filled his ears before everything had gone black was never going to stop. Leaning in, he pressed his lips to Cecil's forehead and swiftly pulled back, inspecting his father's face for a reaction, a muscle twitch, a flutter behind his eyelids, anything. But Cecil simply remained asleep, his nearly transparent hands draped over his abdomen.
I know Cecil is praying for us. Praying for the moon to disappear. For our homeland to be saved.
Theodore turned and saw his mother standing in the threshold, her exhausted gaze falling upon him. It was only then that he noticed the piles of rubble in the room and the gaping hole in the ceiling above, exposing a pitch-black, star-dotted sky. He had a feeling the mess had something to do with why he had ended up tucked away in a bed.
Mother. Where are we? Did we make it to the moon?
She nodded, extending her hand.
Come with me, dear. There's something you need to see.
Together, they crossed through the ship to the bridge. Although Theodore was disturbed at how quiet everything seemed to be, where was everyone? Had other people gotten hurt too? Even when he had secluded himself with Cecil, he could hear snatches of the buzz of their new comrades pouring in. He had even felt his heart skip a beat when he swore he heard Asila's obnoxious bray telling someone off. That was kind of weird. He attributed it to simultaneous relief that she was okay and the fear of what it would mean for his safety if they were trapped in space together, with no other punching bags for her amusement in sight. When they reached the bridge, Theodore only saw a couple figures, Kane, leaning against a row of panels, his head lowered and his arms crossed, and Golbez, kneeling on the floor, a swirl of black spilled behind him from his cape. He was sweeping piles of glittering dust into a tidy pile, and had been investigating a slender shard of what appeared to be glass when they had walked in. He lifted his gaze from the residue in his hand to the boy, and Theodore got the feeling of ice water being poured down his spine when they locked eyes.
You're awake,
Kane declared, and Theodore snapped out of his stupor, noticing now that the dust was everywhere. He bit his lip, wincing as he took a step forward and crushed some of it beneath his feet.
What happened here? The crystal of flight shattered,
Golbez said calmly, scooping some of the dust between his hands and letting it rain down like an overturned hourglass.
Right before we made our landing. I'm fairly confident it was the mysterious girl's doing. The same thing happened on the Red Moon, each of the crystals shattered before my eyes, one by one. There was nothing Fusoya or I could do. We were already far too late to stop what was in motion by the time we both woke up. What?
Theodore gasped.
Does that mean we're trapped here now? That appears to be the case, at least for the time being,
Rosa frowned.
Nothing on the ship works anymore, so we don't have radar or a map. The others went out to explore on their own, but no one's returned.
Theodore gulped, and she nodded.
We're the only ones left.
Golbez stood up, letting the crystal shard drop from his hands and fall to the floor with a gentle ting. It sounded like a quaint toast made over dinner.
It's been a few hours. Now that Theodore is awake, I'll start looking for them. He can help defend the ship if any unsavory visitors come. No.
Rosa cried, and Theodore and Kane both looked to her in surprise. She grabbed Golbez's arm, although it was more for show than anything else. She could barely wrap her fingers around his sinewy forearm, let alone truly physically stop him from going anywhere. He glared down at her, but she didn't relent, pressing her chipped, white-tipped fingernails into his skin.
We don't know what's out there, that's why we agreed to go out in groups. If the others ran into something horrible that they couldn't fight off, what hope do you have alone?
Golbez raised his eyebrows, gently yanking his arm back. He really didn't want to remind her what he was capable of, given the circumstances of the very delicate dance of acceptance everyone was pantomiming, but he might have to if she kept trying to get in his way. She had been using the boy as an excuse as to why none of them should leave to go after the others, and now that Theodore was up and about, she no longer had a leg to stand on.
I think I'll manage.
Kane shook his head, pressing one foot against the metal-plated wall.
She's right, you know. If we're going to leave the lunar whale, let's do it together. Cecil's going to come back for us, and the only way we can ensure that happens is if we combine our strengths. If the others found something worth investigating, do you really think any of them would come back here and tell us first? They'd want to take it on themselves, because that's what any of us standing here would do, too. I'm sure if we proceed, we'll catch up with them.
All Golbez could do was sigh. Honestly, do these people ever quit? He already knew the answer to that though, of course.
But you bring up a most critical issue,
Golbez frowned.
Who is going to stay behind and protect Cecil? The dolls.
That second question had been rhetorical. Kalka and Brina were currently in a heap on the floor in one of the dorms, their bodies hastily shut down by Luca after she and Golbez had witnessed what the mysterious girl had been able to do to the lunar whale systems. Luca had not wanted to take any chances after what had happened the last time the mysterious girl had gotten her magic into them.
There will be no one here to defend him if something were to happen. We'll bring him with us,
Kane said a little too quickly. Golbez realized that was what he had been planning to do all along.
It won't be difficult for me to carry him. You and Theodore can take point, and Rosa will act as our defense should we need it.
Rosa offered a small smile when Golbez's glare bounced from Kane back to her. Theodore, at least, had the audacity to look confused about if something like that would really work. He was giving Kane a questioning look that he was in turn pointedly ignoring. At least one of these damn Baronians has a lick of common sense.
Don't be ridiculous,
Golbez sneered, shaking his head.
Have you forgotten that you're a dragoon, and fight in the air? You won't be of any use to anyone with an invalid slung over your shoulder, you're just going to get both yourself and Cecil killed. So, what are we supposed to do?
Rosa huffed, and Golbez pressed his hand to his forehead, letting out a quiet moan. He knew he had walked right into her trap as soon as he opened his mouth, but he supposed none of it mattered now. Kane may have been hopeful about the others being okay, but Golbez knew that they couldn't rely on that to be fact. It really might fall to them to unravel the mysteries of the true moon. And to find the panacea for Cecil's curse.
I can fight with my magic as well, if not better than any sword. I guess that means Cecil's welfare falls to me.
Rosa's lips curled into a small smile of relief, and Kane nodded in agreement. Golbez couldn't help but notice Theodore's anxious, pleading stare toward Rosa. He knew right away what the boy had to have been thinking, as it was the same thought running through his mind as well. You're leaving Cecil in the hands of the madman who once tried to murder him in cold blood?
Ugh.
Rydia rolled over, her throat clenching as she choked on what felt like a million granules of moon dust. There wasn't a speck of light as far as the eye could see. She was surrounded in total darkness, her heart skipping a beat every time a noise, real or imagined, resonated around her. In an attempt to calm her racing heart, she tried to piece back together the fragmented memories that had seemingly imploded along with her body when she came crashing to wherever she was now. She traced her memory back to when the lunar whale had shuddered to a drawn-out, violent stop, her body banging into several chairs as she fell and leaving evidence of the encounter with the bruises and cuts she spied on her knees now. A rush of blurry faces had come to her rescue, maybe Yang and Ursula, and then had come the sound of shattering glass on the other side of the wall behind her. Next thing she knew, she was standing in the bridge, her mind spinning as she observed the carnage that had overtaken their ship. The crystal of flight had shattered, and Golbez and Luca had been thrown into the dash from the emergency landing. They had shared with Rydia the crystal's final message before imploding. The true moon. That's what the crystal of flight called this place. Without any way of knowing where they had landed, Edge had gotten antsy and insisted on exploring the moon's surface while the others recovered from the crash. Before Rydia or anyone else could stop him, he had disappeared, and a few hours later, had still not made his return. I should have gone with him, Rydia had thought, her eyes stinging as she had paced up and down the length of the ship and obsessively checked in on the blacked-out Theodore and comatose Cecil. He's still as reckless as ever, his challenging Ifrit in Eblan should have been enough proof of that. Finally, she had had enough of doing nothing and decided she needed to strike out on her own and find the missing king. But Yang had offered to escort her, as frustrated as she that the mysterious girl had seemingly yanked the proverbial welcome mat out from underneath them upon their arrival. It was odd that the enemy had not yet attacked after they had managed to ensnare the lunar whale in their trap. It had Yang worrying that something even more sinister was planned for them. He felt perhaps they could head it off. Because Yang was going, Ursula then demanded that she go too. And then Luca followed suit. Which then snowballed into Sid refusing to let his apprentice out of his sight. He would feel personally responsible if something happened to Luca now that the two of them had been reunited. Just like Cecil, Kane, and Rosa, Sid considered Luca to be another one of his foster children, or grandchildren, depending on how old he felt when you asked. Thus, the five of them had set out, promising the remaining members of their party that they too would return, with Edge in tow. But then something had happened that Rydia was now having trouble recalling. There had been the mouth of a cavern, a flash of light, and the seemingly eternal fall.
Rydia, are you awake?
A semi-familiar female voice drifted from the darkness, and the fog in Rydia's mind cleared itself enough for her to register that it belonged to Ursula.
Yes, I am. Where are we? I don't know. But you had better come see this. It's insane.
Great.
Insane
Is just what we need right now.
Do you see Edge anywhere? No. Sorry. It just seems to be the five of us.
Rydia had to grasp onto the jagged wall behind her to haul herself to her feet. Staring up, she could see no evidence of a hole they might have fallen through, or even an indication of just how tall the cavern was. Ursula called out to her again, and she gingerly took a few steps forward, dragging her fingers along the wall. She heard the pad of satiny footsteps, and a few moments later, felt Ursula's hand slip into hers. Her pigtailed curls brushed Rydia's shoulders as she looked her up and down. Rydia felt like a little kid being investigated for scrapes by her mother. Ursula was already several inches taller than her, and probably had a good amount of growing yet to go, being that she had Yang's DNA.
You're limping. It's just a little further. Once we're in the light, I can see your body's chakra points and draw upon spiritual energy to revitalize you.
Rydia couldn't help but smile slightly through her pain at Ursula's declaration. First Theodore, and now Ursula. These children aren't just little kids anymore. Someday soon, they're going to surpass their elders in every way imaginable. I can practically feel the power she holds brimming against my fingers. A fantastic energy that I've never even sensed within her father at these levels. The shadows of three other figures were coming into view: Sid, Luca, and Yang, their forms enveloped in a warm, orange light that seemed strangely nostalgic and set Rydia's heart racing once more. As she lifted her hand from the wall, she noticed that they were smudged in a silver residue that perfectly captured the swirling fine lines of her fingerprints. Lifting her fingers to her nose, she inhaled quietly, a leaden taste flooding her tongue. It was as if she had stuck a fistful of gil into her mouth. Metal? What in the world? As her eyes adjusted to her new scenery, she realized that Ursula had led her to an overarching cliff that spilled into a valley of wood, houses, buildings, roads, even black, spiraling, petrified trees that were forever frozen with their yearning branches extended skyward. Surrounding the valley were tumbling falls of pulsing, glowing magma, their only source of light. The blood drained from Rydia's face as she dropped Ursula's hand and limped to the edge of the cliff, dumbfounded as to what any of this could possibly mean. Her boots made an odd crunching noise as she made her approach. When she glanced down, she saw hundreds of red, shimmering shards spilled over the cliffs, an ocean of crystallized blood beneath her feet.
But how can we be here? What is all this?
Rydia asked, her voice shaking. Luca, who was cupping a handful of the shards and holding the magnifying glass Sid had relinquished from his tool belt, shook her head and turned her palm over to let them spill back upon the ground.
They're rubies. Hundreds and hundreds of crushed rubies.
No. No. Rydia shuddered, pressing her metal-stained fingers to the hyacinth wilting behind her ear thanks to the sudden swell of heat. What is she trying to prove?
Do you know this place, Rydia?
Yang asked, and she nodded, turning back to the valley. In the far distance, she saw the brief flicker of yellow silk ripple in the horizon, and the silhouette of a deific apparition with long, ribbon-like limbs rising on the roof of one of the very furthest buildings. When she blinked, the figure disappeared, and an obelisk of pale red light could be seen bleeding into the flow of the magma. A waypoint? Or perhaps a warning.
You will have to seek darkness and starlight in order to save the others.
She wrapped her arms around herself, closing her eyes. In the darkness, she was greeted with the flash of violet eyes, and the gleam of a scimitar's edge, glistening with blood.
This is the Fame Arch.
Porum gave the pair of white frosted glass doors one final push, throwing the entirety of her backside against them and releasing an unflattering grunt as she slowly slid to the floor, panting for breath and looking up at the others behind a curtain of sweat-marred bangs.
It's no good. Some kind of force is blocking the way. How did we get here?
Leonora whispered, although she might as well have been shouting. The corridor was eerily silent with the exception of the buzzing hum of glowing, pulsing lights that reminded her of the lunar whale, except far more aseptic and cold. Their voices echoed maddeningly over the glass walls and ceilings, making it sound as if far more than the 5 of them were milling about. But Porum was fairly sure they were alone. Fairly.
And you're quite positive this is the Tower of Babel?
Harley had her notebook whipped out, scribbling as fast as her brain could fire out her thoughts. It didn't seem to bother her a bit that they had not only stumbled upon a location that should have been physically impossible for them to reach, being that the tower was east of Eblin on the blue planet, but that they had now firmly established that they were confined in said locale as well. She was way too fascinated by the futuristic tower's trappings to be bothered by minor details like that at the moment.
Oh, I'm sure. You don't forget a hellhole like this in your entire lifetime.
Porum drawled, and Leonora's cheeks reddened.
Porum? Is that type of language really? Sorry,
Porum shrugged.
But what should I call it, then? I don't think it really matters,
Porum frowned, burying her head in her hands and exhaling slowly.
At any rate, hellhole is apropos, at least for this place.
She and Porum had only been in the Tower of Babel once as small children. When they had first arrived, it had been a thrill that Cecil had not only asked them to accompany him to help Rydia find whatever it was that was calling to her from within, but to also explore the haunting monolith that had been overflowing with magical energy. But the Rydia had turned out to be nothing more than a fake to lure Cecil into a trap, and when the tower summoned beasts turned themselves upon them at her command, they would have all been surely buried there if the real Rydia hadn't turned out just in time. Even all these years later, the battle against Rydia's doppelganger had been one of the most harrowing of their young lives. Not many people could say that they stood against the All-Father of the Eidolons and walked away in mostly one piece. After all that, Porum was quite satisfied with never setting foot in there again and leaving the care of the tower to the Eblinessa, and in a rare occasion, her brother was on the same page as she.
The others are probably worried sick by this point,
Edward sighed. He had been pressing his palms against every glass panel he could reach, trying to see if he could trigger a hidden door, anything that would give them a hint on how to get out of here.
You all have my deepest apologies, if I hadn't insisted on seeking out Rydia and the others.
He lowered his head.
I failed her 17 years ago when I couldn't save her from Leviathan. I thought that maybe this time, if she were in danger, I could. Don't apologize, King Edward.
Leonora shook her head.
How were we supposed to know that entering a cavern would lead to all this? The footprints outside matched those of the others. It only made sense to follow them here. Yeah, what she said,
Porum smirked.
Anyway, we only have ourselves to blame for following you, Porum.
Porum growled in a warning tone. He raised his eyebrows in her direction, silently challenging her to point out which part he had spoken was untruthful, but mercifully decided to keep his big mouth shut when she drew a threatening finger across her throat. Edward was in enough of a tizzy as it was, and she didn't want Porum making him feel guiltier or weak for accepting their offer to accompany him. When Edward had announced on the lunar whale that he and Harley would seek Rydia out, it had been Porum's idea to convince him to bring her along. She had explained that if they found anyone that was hurt, her white magic could help. But Porum had interpreted Porum's volunteerism as a not-so-subtle way of telling Edward and Harley that they would be moon dust if they set even 1 foot outside the lunar whale, so he had forced himself into their group too, and dragged poor Leonora along for the ride. Porum was 90% sure that Porum only had intentions of showing off for his new, naive friend, and was not exclusively motivated by the idea of keeping their old friends or sisters safe. And if they now had no way of returning to the lunar whale, that left only Cain, Rosa, Golbez, and Theodore to protect both the ship and Cecil.
What powers a place like this?
Harley asked, chewing on the top of her pen. Edward shot her a thankful look for the distracting question. He had not been sure how to respond to Palem's blunt comment, and bursting into tears wasn't a viable option, even if that was all he wanted to do.
I'm not sure of the answer,
Porum said.
Cecil once told us that the tower was built with Lunarian technology, that's why it's so advanced compared to anything we have. But the tower itself actually only comes alive for its true purpose when all of the planet's crystals have been gathered. It opens something called an interdimensional elevator that links the blue planet to other celestial bodies. Interdimensional elevator,
Harley's eyes sparkled with curiosity behind her glasses.
So maybe we were taken back to our planet. If that were the case, wouldn't this work?
Edward frowned, pulling from his cloak the small bouquet of whisperweed. The flowers hadn't emitted a single peep, remaining as dead as they had when the lunar whale had been dragged into the new moon's orbit.
Good point,
Harley nodded.
I retract my theory. So, this isn't the real Tower of Babel, then?
Palm blinked.
But who would go through such effort just to build a fake tower with all of these perfect details? And maybe it's not a fake that someone built,
Leonora suddenly piped up, much to everyone's surprise. She instantly flushed when all eyes fell to her, inwardly cringing but managing to stammer her way through the rest of her thought.
It could be an illusion. Something someone wants us to see.
Palem's eyes widened, and he slapped his fist into his palm.
Of course. Like the epochs and the hidden path in the lodestone cavern.
Leonora nodded, her nervous pout cracking into the tiniest of smiles.
Yes. Exactly like that. Which means our true path may be hidden elsewhere. Leonora, you're a genius,
Edward smiled, and she brought her hands to her mouth, her billowing sleeves swallowing the bottom half of her face.
No, I just... We'll keep looking, then.
Porum jumped up, purposefully tucking her hair behind her ears. Straight ahead was a corridor that eventually split off into two wings of open floor space. Unfortunately, there didn't seem to be much to them other than more lights and more dizzying reflections of themselves from the glass to greet them. And as sterile and undisturbed as this place seemed to be when they had entered, it didn't seem likely that Edge or Rydia had taken this path. So where had they ended up instead? Porum let her surge of positive energy fade into oblivion as soon as the others had turned their back to her, all of them going off into separate directions for another round of exploring. She couldn't help but feel that they may have walked right into a trap. Forget about going home, would they even ever see the light of day again? So, this is what it's like to be on another world. Without the sun or the lights of the cities, you can see the stars as clearly as if they were fireflies in a jar at your bedside. It is beautiful, in an alien, lonely way. A drifting moon without the bounties of the crystals, no soil from which life can spring nor return, no wind to carry your breath to your friends, no water to purify, and no fire to sustain warmth. How can those girls possibly thrive here? Why do they hate our world so much that they wish to destroy it? Father, I wish you could see all of this. I wish I could hear your voice. I wish, more than anything else, you could tell me not to be afraid. Theodore didn't realize his hands had been clutched in prayer until he tripped over something sharp concealed in the silky dust of the moonscape, and went falling forward. Not being able to untangle his fingers in time, he fell flat on his face, visibly cringing as a spray of grit stung his eyes. He had been trailing behind the others, and Rosa turned to see what had happened.
Theodore. Are you okay? Yes.
His eyes had begun to water, much to his relief, rinsing away the contaminants in his vision.
What did I trip on?
They had been following several pairs of footprints that had led away from the lunar whale to the south, none of them very well defined anymore, but all were certainly pointing to the evidence that someone, be they friend or enemy, had been nearby. As Theodore rolled over onto his back, Rosa knelt down and plucked the object sticking out of the dust, blowing it clean before holding it up to the sparse starlight. It was a four-pointed, black steel shuriken, the tips stained with just the slightest hint of crimson.
Edge.
Rosa trailed off, biting her lip.
So, he was here.
Kane turned around, and Rosa handed him the shuriken.
He must have gotten attacked. Hopefully the monster was dusted, and not him.
Ugh. Theodore suddenly gagged and forced himself to spit, realizing that meant he had potentially inhaled a face full of monster corpses. Rosa lowered her head, and Golbez, who hadn't stopped walking throughout the entire exchange, shifted Cecil's weight to his right arm and pointed ahead.
The footprints end here. There's a cavern just beyond this slope. Let's go, Theodore,
Rosa said, extending her hand. Theodore used it to pull himself up, registering the deep sadness that had flooded her gaze before quickly looking away. She's terrified too. I'm sure she never thought she would have to do something like this again. Especially without Father by her side. At the entrance to the cave, Theodore dared to steal a peek at Cecil's still form. He hadn't moved an inch since Golbez had lifted him from the pod, the rise and fall of his breath even too shallow to register in the stillness of the moon's atmosphere. As blood-chilling as it had been before, Theodore would have gladly taken a scream or a fit from Cecil at that very moment, just for the tiny assurance that he still had some spark of life left within him, no matter how impossibly small.
"What's that?"
Rosa asked, pointing deeper within the cavern. A gentle blue light was dancing along the rear cave wall, floating upward in soft blue spheres that looked like champagne bubbles. Other than the light, the cave appeared to be nondescript and empty, maybe a place someone could camp for the night, but not much bigger than that.
"It's emitting a powerful magic,"
Golbez said bluntly.
"Be careful."
"Edge," Kane called, stepping inside.
"Rightia, Edward."
There came no reply. Kane's boots clicked against the floor of the cavern as he approached the light, the rainbow-plated scales of his armor erupting in a riot of colors.
"Kane,"
Golbez warned, and Rosa screamed as a scintillating flash of light engulfed the cave, swallowing Kane whole. She chased him inside, grasping Kane's arm just as she could feel him fading away beneath her fingertips.
"Come, Theodore,"
Golbez gasped, grabbing the boy's hand and dashing forward into the brilliance. Theodore cried out as an agonizing slash of pain tore across his temple, clenching his eyes shut as the light robbed him of his remaining senses and sent him spiraling through space. When he next opened his eyes, he found himself standing upright, his hands tightly balled into fists. Rosa and Kane were staring at their surroundings in open-mouthed horror, while Golbez was clenching his jaw so hard that Theodore could swear he heard his bones cracking. Cecil remained limp in Golbez's arms, dying motes of blue light fading against his hair. They had been deposited in yet another cave, though this one was much larger than its predecessor. When Theodore looked up, he could no longer see the sky or the stars, just an infinite sea of black. Mirroring the black below was a chasm that surrounded the island of rock they were standing upon, their only way out and across the chasm a crudely carved flight of stairs carved into the wall of the next level of the chamber.
"Where are we now?"
Theodore frowned, gently kicking at the ground. A web of bone-like veins blanketed the cavern floor, the gaps between each groove covered in a fine dusting of silver and white. They appeared so delicate that they would crumble beneath his weight. As the dust flew into the air from his kick, he swore he saw a strange flicker of black and white and heard the hiss of something. Not quite human. Mechanical, almost. Like an airship engine. But when he looked down again, the dust had settled once more, and the chamber was silent with the exception of everyone's raspy breathing, including his own.
"This is..."
Rosa trailed off.
"The lunar subterrane,"
Golbez finished for her, shaking his head.
"How can this be?"
Kane hissed.
"We haven't transported ourselves to the Red Moon, right? So how can there be two of them? Will someone please tell me what's going on?"
Theodore cried, feeling his nervousness escalate with each new utterance of disbelief from the adults.
"What is the lunar subterrane?" "It's where we fought Zemus before you were born,"
Rosa explained distractedly, her eyebrows arching as a strangled cry emanated from the depths below.
"It used to contain the village where the Lunarians convened before they went to sleep." "Right, Golbez."
"Yes," Golbez affirmed.
"But the only way you can reach the lunar subterrane is using the lunar crystal's energy as a gateway. That's how Fusoya was able to seal Zemus within once upon a time and how we were able to sleep unguarded these past 17 years. But you said on the lunar whale that those crystals had shattered."
Theodore frowned, and Golbez nodded.
"Right. So, the fact that we're here is deeply troubling. Understood?"
"Yes," Theodore muttered, looking back to his feet.
"Crystal clear." "We could try to use teleport to backtrack,"
Kane suggested.
"It's worth a shot,"
Rosa nodded, extending her arms.
"Everyone, grab onto me."
They obeyed, and Rosa cast the spell, a hopeful lilt in her voice as she recited the incantation. But instead of the world around them fading away with a cleansing glow and being replaced by the desolate moonscape, her spell echoed emptily throughout the sprawling chamber, and Theodore didn't feel so much as a flutter in his hair. Rosa dropped her arms with a huff, cursing unintelligibly under her breath. Kane shook his head.
"I guess that would have been too easy." "Maybe this is why the others didn't come back,"
Rosa sighed.
"But if that's the case, perhaps it means we'll catch up to them. Or we're in a trap,"
Golbez muttered. As they discussed what they should do next, Theodore climbed the stairs that revealed the next layer of the subterrane, letting out a quiet sigh as he took in the spiraling path before him that eventually bled into darkness. If this really is the lunar subterrane of Cecil and Golbez's past, that means I am walking my father's path yet again. But this time, I walk with his comrades and his enemies. He glanced over his shoulder at Golbez, who was saying something to Kane, but had his eyes cut squarely on Theodore. Theodore shuddered, quickly turning a corner so that Golbez's icy glare could no longer reach him. I still can't believe that he's my father's elder brother. My only paternal blood relative. All my life, I've grown up to believe that Golbez was the fiend who destroyed my parents' lives and nearly the entire world. Yet they failed to tell me the most horrific truth of it all. He pressed his hand to his mouth, stifling a whimper. Everything I believed about my namesake was a lie. Why would father name me after someone so heinous? Theodore came to a halt a few minutes later when he came to a black glass door framed with navy-imbued steel, no latch or handle in sight for him to take hold of. At the base of the door was a devastating sight, black crystal pieces spilled all over the ground, the light long faded from each shard's face. Kneeling down, Theodore picked up one of the shards, holding it up to his face so that only his cerulean eye reflected back at him in the dim light of the subterrane. Another shattered crystal? Is it one of the lunar crystals from Golbez's home? Father, please, tell me, what are we supposed to do?
Oh my gods! Theodore, is that you?
Theodore lifted his head in surprise at the familiar shout, the crystal shard slipping in his fingers and slicing cleanly through the flesh of his palm as he stumbled awkwardly to catch it before it shattered into yet more pieces. Wincing and pressing the bleeding skin to his lips, he turned around, but saw no one behind him. Hey! Must have been my imagination. For a moment, I thought I heard her, of all people.
Over here. In front of you.
Theodore blinked, staring into the swirling darkness of the glass before him. A pale pair of lithe legs had appeared, his eyes trailing up the length of a tattered red cheongsam dress and two very familiar fists. He slowly stood up, his palms still pressed to his mouth as he stared dumbly at the reflection of the champagne-eyed, yellow-curled girl glaring at him impatiently. She certainly looks like Princess Ursula. But there's something different about her. Something I can't quite put my finger on.
Is that really you?
Theodore mumbled against the spill of blood, and she nodded, eyes flashing.
You okay? I will be.
Theodore blushed, yanking his hand away and looking at a droplet of blood on his lower lip. Why, of all times, did she have to show up when he looked like a vulnerable idiot? Couldn't a guy cry over his disaster of a family in peace even in the far reaches of space? Ursula came closer to the glass, her eyeballs darting about curiously.
I can't tell where you are. Can you see anything on my end? No.
Theodore shook his head.
It looks like you're standing in a black room. Damn.
Ursula shook her head, sighing.
Same with you. I'm in a place that Rydia calls the Famarch. It's kind of like a village, only there are no people, it's 1,000,000 degrees, and Rydia has us crawling through every single empty house looking for a way out. I stumbled across this strange door in the village square, and saw a flash of blue. For a moment, I thought you were your father. But then, the rest of you appeared. My father.
Theodore stared down at the crystal shard, biting his lip. A flash of blue. Did something happen when I gazed into the crystal? Ursula tilted her head.
So, if you're not in the Famarch, then where exactly are you? Who's with you?
Theodore quickly explained everything that had happened since they had left the lunar whale, and how they had materialized in the lunar subterrane with no way out. When he was finished, Ursula tapped her finger to her chin, sighing.
Edge is still missing, and Edward, Harley and those 3 mages went out on their own too.
Yeah, Theodore shook his head.
I woke up after they left, though. I hope they're all okay. Me too.
Ursula's tone softened a bit.
How is Uncle Cecil faring? He hasn't changed a bit.
Her gaze flicked away guiltily.
Oh, I see.
Theodore stared at his upturned wrist, watching placidly as another bead of blood slowly ran down the curve of his palm and splashed onto the crystal shards below. He wasn't sure exactly why he felt compelled to tell Ursula what was racing through his mind at that moment, but he let it all spill forth in a rush of breath before he could change his mind.
But I have a strange feeling. Even though father hasn't stirred since we landed on the moon, I think he understands what is happening here. All of it.
Ursula blinked, pressing her hands to the glass as she leaned in closer.
You've changed, Theodore. Hey.
Theodore lifted his gaze warily, ready for the punchline. But when he looked into her eyes, he was shocked to see something unfamiliar, but tender, sympathy, perhaps. Reflecting back at him.
The Theodore I knew always acted like there was a heavy burden placed on his shoulders. That burden of being the Prince of Baron. No, the burden of having Cecil and Rose's blood in his veins.
Theodore's cheeks tinged as he closed his eyes. He could easily recall the burn of Big's hand against his cheek and the throb in his shoulder when he had gotten smacked around on the deck of the Red Wings fleet for whining about that very same subject just days ago. He wanted to die of shame just thinking about that awful morning, recalling how foolishly he had been acting while at that very moment his father was likely fighting for his life against whatever curse that wretched girl had laid upon him.
You're right. It always made me wonder, why did you never feel a sense of pride about your family?
He thought about it for a moment before answering.
I guess I had to learn how to.
Ursula drew in a quiet breath.
From whom? From Kane, and Biggs, and Wedge. And from all the people my father once fought with.
He bit his lip, thinking of the other Lunarian in that chamber, the one who literally held Cecil's life in his blood-stained hands, the same blood that also ran through Theodore's veins, regardless of whatever name that man went by now.
And those he fought against, too. I always hoped that you would learn it for yourself.
Ursula's smile greeted him as he opened his eyes, and he felt something strange flutter in his chest as he drank in the pale pink swell of her mouth.
I suppose my father did too, come to think of it. I guess we're both pretty lucky we've got patient parents, hey?
Theodore nodded, suddenly realizing what had been bothering him about her this entire time. It was like his senses had finally been stirred from a fog-ridden nap. His eyes fell on the rose headband perched in her hair.
I see that your birthday present arrived. Do you like it? Hey.
Ursula reached up, brushing her fingers over the silken petals.
Like it? I absolutely adore it. It's already been to a watery grave and back, and it still looks divine. I'm thinking about making it my trademark piece, you know. It really suits you,
Theodore smiled.
I'm so glad I stumbled upon the artisan that makes them. I saw him selling them to some of my schoolmates in town, and when I asked if he could make one to match the roses in Baron's gardens, he said it would be his pleasure. I remembered how much you liked going to those gardens when you used to visit, so I thought you should have a Baronian rose that would be with you no matter where you went.
Ursula pressed her lips into a thin line, and Theodore blanched, wondering if he had said something offensive. Maybe buying a princess birthday gift from a street vendor was uncalled for? He had never taken Ursula to be the materialistic type, but there was an awful lot he didn't know about women in general.
Wait. You mean Uncle Cecil didn't pick this out? Well, no,
Theodore flushed, scratching his head.
I did. But, he paid for it, and everything. It really is a gift from the family. I didn't mean to make it sound like it was just from me.
He could feel fire that had ignited on his cheeks spreading to his ears and neck.
That would be weird, right?
She quickly shook her head, choking out a half-laugh.
Not weird at all. I was just surprised. You have wonderful taste for someone who doesn't get out much.
There's the real Ursula, Theodore thought, but her rather tame, for her, insult comforted him far more than he thought could ever be possible. He realized this was a sad testament to what his life had become. Turning so that Theodore couldn't see the blush exploding across her face, Ursula rested her shaking hands upon her hips.
Don't worry. I'm sure your father will be back to normal in no time.
Thanks, Theodore nodded, even though he knew she could no longer see him.
I should be getting back to the others. These doors have to be more than just two-way mirrors. There must be a way to use them to get to each other. I'm with you there. I'll tell Rydia, my father, and Luca what we found. In the meantime, stay diligent. We have no way of knowing what is lurking down here. Got it.
Ursula's side of the mirror went dark, and Theodore was once again greeted with his reflection. He sighed, pressing his forehead into the glass and closing his eyes so that he didn't have to wince under the piercing glow of his own stare. It ached too much to see his father's Lunarian legacy branded so intensely within his features. It would seem we are at least closer to our comrades than we originally thought, but what kind of magic is at play that has warped us to totally different locations? The lunar subterrane of the Red Moon? And the Fey March of the underworld? What's the connection? Cain, Rosa, and Golbez emerged from the previous chamber, Rosa calling Theodore's name when she finally spotted him in the churning darkness. His eyes fluttered open as he turned toward her voice, his lips parting to speak as a plum-colored, meaty hand extended toward him from the mirror, milky white eyes erupting from slits of its knuckles. Throbbing fingers melded together and transformed into a python's jaws, a single crack of bone on bone disrupting the still air as the newly formed maw lurched for the curve of Theodore's neck. Edge slammed his palm against the mechanism impatiently, sparing a half-second to assess the escalating situation behind him and instantly regretting it. He let out another vulgar string of curses aloud and smashed the button harder, blowing a lock of sweat-soaked hair out of his face.
Come on, you piece of... I'm dying out here.
An army of clockwork soldiers was roving toward him, the abomination's spiked metal feet smashing the last of the glass tiles before the wired metal drawbridge that had temporarily granted Edge a modicum of safety. He had figured that once he made it into the crystal chamber that he knew was waiting for him on the other side, he could trigger the trapdoor inside for an easy escape, just like he had previously done with the mysterious girl chasing him down. He still wasn't quite sure how he had managed to make his way into the Tower of Babel again from what had looked like a simple cavern, but found he didn't have much time to question his surroundings before the monsters had begun their advance. He had run out of mana hours ago to call upon any more ninjutsu blitz magic to fry the bastards, and it seemed that no matter how many he took out, 5 more reappeared for each one defeated. Their steel-plated exoskeletons made his weapons fairly useless, and they had the speed and precision an organic monster or human would normally be lacking, so even his supernatural agility didn't give him much of a lead in the fight. The monsters were never this bad in the tower, even when Golbez was hiding the crystals here during the war. It would seem someone is out for my blood. At long last, the control panel for the door lit up green, and the God-sent whistle of the metal plate lifting from the ground revealed the familiar crystal chamber. Diving beneath the door as soon as it had gained enough inches in the air to accept his form, Edge rolled over and smashed the button on the inside of the opposite wall, barking out a desperate laugh as the door slammed back shut and one pointed limb crashed into it, causing a small swell to bloom at the impact site. The commotion outside only continued to grow louder and louder, but he no paid them any mind. Let them jostle each other off the bridge, for all he cared, he was staying put until his lungs and his leg muscles were no longer hemorrhaging precious oxygen. Besides, there was the small matter of the other bastards that he now had to deal with.
What are you here for?
Edge spat, and his inquiry, at first, went unanswered. But sure enough, a few moments later, 4 columns of different colored smoke erupted in front of the 2 frontmost crystal pillars and Gekao, Zangetsu, Izayoi, and Tsukinawa appeared, darkness flooding their eyes. Zangetsu was the first to brave a step forward. He was clutching his spear, using it as a walking stick as he hobbled to the front of the group.
Master.
Tsukinawa stammered, tugging his cowl up higher so that he could hide as much of his face as possible. Izayoi bent to one knee, bowing her head.
I apologize.
But Gekao offered no words and made no motion. He continued to stare at Edge, his black eyes hardened like flint, and his arms defensively crossed over his chest.
I told you to keep watch at the castle for me,
Edge said, his calm, disconnected tone having the same effect on the air as the room suddenly plummeting several degrees in temperature. Finally, Tsukinawa forced himself to speak, his gaze lowered to the floor.
We couldn't just stay there and watch, Master. Not while this moon is advancing ever closer to our homeland. So, you snuck onto the lunar whale at great danger to yourself, and then followed me all the way here, thinking you were being so clever? How could you think that I wouldn't possibly pick up on your chakras as soon as you opened your mouth to breathe?
None of them bothered to ask him to delve into any further detail. Of course, it had been silly for them to hope he would not have picked up on being tailed. That was Stealth 101, for God's sake. But still, he had played along with their little game for the near entirety of their journey, and had cruelly implanted a sense of false hope precisely for the payoff of this moment, where he would proceed to tear them down to shreds and make each other pick up the pieces. Gekao snorted, shaking his head.
We've come here to defend our honor, my lord. This isn't just about you, or Eblin. It's about us, our world. We have a right to be here, just as much as you or any of the others.
Zangetsu nodded in agreement.
My creaky old body may not be capable of much, but if it'll help stop this moon, I will gladly lay my life on the line. I accept the consequences if that's what it all comes down to in the end. I truly do, Master. I would not want to be reunited with my son so soon if it meant a foolish waste of what he once sacrificed for me, for Eblin, too, and I think you feel that way too, deep inside. I wanted to contribute to the cause, no matter how little it may help in the end.
Izayoi frowned.
I was only able to selfishly save Chisaki and myself during the First War, now, I want to save all of my people. Never again will I let myself feel as if I don't have anything of value to offer our world. I carry Eblin in my heart with every mission I've ever taken on, with every breath that's left my lips, and now with every star I've crossed in this infinite galaxy. You can demote me, or punish me, or make me conduct every mission for the rest of my life as a seductress, I don't care anymore. As long as I live truly by my heart, I'll be at peace with who I am. Isn't that what you've wanted this whole time for us?
Edge reddened, climbing off of the floor and making his way toward them, each pointed word accompanied by the stomp of his foot.
Defiant fools. You flatter yourself. As if you've somehow become the end-all, be-all of the shadow arts.
Why? Why are you doing this for me? Doing this for a country that has demanded your loyalty, your blood, your lives, and given you nothing in return? I've tried with every fiber of my being. I've tried to be the monarch you deserve, the leader that inspires bravery, not rebellion, but in the end, I'm still just a spoiled prince, running off to chase down the bad guys by myself. Again. I'm the one who has been selfish. I want to save Eblin too. But I don't want any of you to be the price I have to pay to get it all back. Gekao, Zangetsu, Izayoi, Tsukinawa, Cecil. Rydia. If your blood spilled because of these incapable hands, how would I ever forgive myself? Gekao was the only one who dared to stare Edge in the eye as he went about his tirade. Despair was clouding his master's gaze despite his venom-laced words, and Gekao was reminded of a time 30 years prior, the cold summer night he had watched a scared, lonely princeling wander to the brink during their test of courage, devastation seeping from his pores. I still see you, Edge. Even after all this time, I see the real you standing here before me, the lingering shadow beneath the pomp and circumstance of your titles and your rank. The Edge that so few in this world have ever truly known. Those are the people you fight for above all others, just as Golbez said. If you were only willing to speak of what's truly in your heart, you would be free from so much chaos, from the very chains you cast upon yourself long ago. And if not now, while we're on the brink of losing everything that matters to us, then when?
No.
Gekao shook his head, sighing, and Edge paused in place, eyes narrowed.
We are not the end-all, be-all of anything. We strive to push the ninja arts to their very limits, but when our time comes, we will still return to the planet same as any other man or woman, and our essences will serve to fuel the future generations we strive to raise up during our short time in this plane. We are only human, Master, and I do deign to speak for all of us when I say that surely, that is enough for Eblin, and it always has been. The same could be said of you, too.
Edge turned away, silently praying that his cape concealed the sudden shaking that began to rack his knees. It was very difficult for him to not also interpret Gekao's declaration as perhaps a subdued commentary about their own volatile relationship these past 30 years, but Gekao had always been a master at the art of subtlety, just another way that he and Edge were fated to clash for the rest of their days. Thank you, Gekao. I do think I see it now. That if I've done one thing right in this life, it's been allowing you to step forward and foster the beautiful dream you've always envisioned for our homeland, shaping it with your hands, and the hands of those chosen few at your side. The four of you have done more for Eblin's soul than I could ever hope to achieve in my lifetime. And I think I might finally be all right with that. To share the burden with those who are willing. That's what you would do, right, Cecil? Edge crossed his arms over his chest, smiling crookedly to himself.
Well, all the same. Human, or ninja, child, or woman. I will be relying upon you. Master.
Aoi gasped.
Does this mean?
Edge nodded, closing his eyes as he exhaled sharply.
But our promise from before still stands. Yes.
Gekko raised a brow.
Survive. No matter what happens.
As they talked, two ebony-colored crystals manifested from twin pillars of twilight on the daisies behind them, silently shedding their light. A flash caught in the corner of Edge's eye, and he felt a violent chill rush down his spine as his pulse roared in his ears. He lifted his chin as he heard the delicate notes of cracking glass ringing in the air, and then came the explosion, engulfing him and the Eblin Four in a penetrating veil of black. The lights in the corridor dimmed noticeably for a few beats longer than usual, causing Palom and Porum to look up at the same time, their faces twisted with the same look of confusion. Leonora squealed and stumbled back, a panel of the wall in front of her transforming into a shining glass doorway with what looked like pinpricks of starlight dancing behind it on the other side.
What did you do?
Porum blinked, and Palom puffed out his cheeks.
Nothing. Why do you always go straight to blaming me first for everything? Old habits die hard.
Porum shrugged, and Palom growled, clenching his fist.
You're such a... Everyone. Come quickly.
Harley's demanding alto interrupted their fight, and Leonora let out a huff of air she hadn't realized she had been holding in as she watched the twins reluctantly back down from tearing each other to shreds and turn instead to the direction of Harley's voice. The three mages crossed the corridor to the opposite wing, only to find Harley and Edward standing next to an exact replica of the door that had appeared for them.
One of those appeared on our end, too.
Palom frowned.
Did you try going in? Palom.
Porum sighed.
You can't just foolishly waltz into something like that. Oh, I already tried.
Harley blinked, and Porum smacked her palm to her forehead, eliciting a nervous peal of laughter from Leonora. She figured if she couldn't laugh, she would just break down crying instead.
It's locked. Or sealed, perhaps may be the correct term.
Edward added. See? He gingerly knocked on the glass, which gave way to nothing other than a resonating thump.
What were you doing when it appeared?
Leonora asked, and Harley shook her head.
Not a thing. We weren't even talking, so I don't think it was invoked by anything we said. We also were not doing anything of consequence.
Leonora sighed.
Oh dear.
Palom chewed on his lip as he walked over to the door, looking it up and down inch by inch and running his hands over the frame several times. Just when Porum was about to testily ask him if he was going to ask the damn thing out on a date, he stepped back, sucking air in between his teeth.
I think the key is that they appeared at the same time, at dead opposites of the tower floor. So maybe we have to try to enter them simultaneously to break the magic seal. Why you mean, we need to split up?
Leonora gulped, and Palom nodded.
Might be the only way. But maybe we'll be reunited on the other side. Like, when we're dead.
Leonora blinked, and Palom groaned.
No. I meant on the literal other side of the door.
Porum didn't much like that theory, but unfortunately, it seemed to be the only viable idea they had. Edward offered a weak smile, pulling a sprig of whisperweed from his coat and offering it to Porum.
How about Harley and I take the left wing, and you three take the right? We can keep in touch with this. I don't know.
Porum trailed off, pinching the flower between her fingers.
What if there are monsters?
Harley finished for her, shaking her head.
Don't worry about us, Lady Porum. I have my whip, and King Edward has his soothing bard song. And if worse comes to worst, we're both really excellent hiders. That's not a reassuring plan,
Porum muttered, and Palom flicked her arm, making her snarl and cut him a fierce side-eye.
If Harley says they'll be fine, then they'll be fine. Besides, you're not going to make me dump my student on them, are you? That just wouldn't be fair. Oh no, please don't do that,
Leonora flushed.
I don't want to be a burden to the King of Damsion. I've yet to even be properly ordained as an epopt.
The gods help this poor girl, Porum thought to herself. She has no idea which direction is up.
Then it's settled, Edward nodded. When we've reached our positions, we'll do a count of 3 and into the whisperweed and see what happens.
Porum reluctantly followed Palom and Leonora back to their door, clutching the flower. After a few moments, Edward's voice broke through the silence, asking if everyone was ready. Palom shouted back that he was, reaching for the glass. Leonora started the countdown, her eyes catching Porum's as the two girls silently reached for each other's hands. On Edward's side, Harley extended her fingers outward toward the door, her voice catching in her throat as she felt Edward's hand brush over her other wrist. She took one last look at him over her shoulder before plunging forward when 3 fell from his lips, his smile fading in a beam of glistening moonlight that rushed her body and made her feel as if a pair of dragon wings had suddenly unfurled over her back, launching her into an empyrean swell of stars. This feeling of my soul being pulled through space-time itself. I wonder if this door is actually... The horror that had taken hold of Rosa's face registered with Theodore only seconds before he felt the surge of sticky, fetid breath of his assailant drench the back of his neck. A voice was silently screaming inside his chest, the one-worded warning reverberating through his form with each throb of his heart. Danger! 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 Before he could comprehend what he was doing, Theodore reached for Excalibur, whirling around and bringing the blade across the glass in a blur of bleeding twilight. A pair of extended fangs attached to a trembling snake's head tumbled onto the pile of crystal shards, muddy purple blood oozing from the wound Theodore had sundered with his sword. His eyes traveled from the now amputated stump that was twitching from within the mirror, the color draining from his face as he took in the familiar scarlet uniform that normally dressed only the highest ranked of the Baronian Guard, a bevy of tarnished and rusted badges and medals pinned over the jacket's breast. Yet, the man within was not one he had ever seen before. His pale skin was deepening to the same poisoned plum as the still flailing snake's head, oil-slicked golden locks streaked with blood and God knew what else hanging down the sides of his face. Two close-set, onyx-colored eyes illuminated with hatred as they fell upon Theodore, the man licking his gouged, wind-burned lips and revealing a set of razor-sharpened, jaundiced teeth.
Cecil. At long last. I could smell your detestable scent as soon as you set foot in this lunar subterrane.
Theodore didn't even realize he had been flanked by Cain and Rosa, his voice shaking as he raised Excalibur before him, cocking the sword waist-high.
I'm not Cecil. Who are you, and how do you know my father? Not see Cecil.
He hissed, his tongue briefly retreating back into his mouth before flicking back out again, now transformed into a rubbery, forked appendage that hung from the corner of his mouth.
What is the meaning of this? Those eyes. I would know them anywhere.
Cain thrust his arm in front of Theodore, his lance materializing within his hand, and Rosa raised her crossbow to her shoulder, biting her lip.
Theodore. This man is no longer human, and he is no friend of your father. Run away, and let Cain and I take care of him. Mother.
Theodore cried.
Who is he? Why does he wear the Baronian standard?
The monster cackled delightedly, a set of blackened fingernails on his remaining hand tearing away at the flaking flesh on his face to reveal the slick scales of a reptile. Theodore felt a firm grip around his arm, and was yanked backwards as Golbez tossed him behind the length of his cape, Cecil's body slung precariously over his shoulder.
His name was Bigon. He gave himself to darkness. Pledged his fealty to myself and Zemus and betrayed your father when I usurped Baron. He was the chief guardsman when Cecil and I served the Baronian army,
Cain hissed.
But Cecil defeated you.
Rosa cried, and Bigon blinked erratically, his tongue twitching as his eyes mutated into yellow orbs with slits for pupils.
And now I am reborn. By the crystal. To finish what should have been done long ago.
With a guttural roar, he tore himself away from the mirror, the crystal shards crumbling to dust beneath his clodhopper feet. The muscles in his arms and chest swelled so fervently that his uniform ripped to shreds and fluttered to the ground, only the battered scabbard of a royal blade hanging from his waist. What does that mean, reborn from the crystal? Theodore looked up at his father, whose head was hanging over Golbez's back, and was shocked to see Cecil's lips twisted in a pained grimace. The clash of steel exploded in the air as Cain's lance met Bigon's sword, and Cecil's eyes snapped open as a panic-stricken shriek tore from his throat. Glittering hail drifted aimlessly through the air, greeting Edge as he opened his eyes. He found himself flattened against the floor, his cape tangled in a mess around his neck and his skin dusted in crystal debris the color of ash.
What happened?
Gekao lifted his head from his arms, reaching up to nonchalantly pluck a shard embedded in his arm.
Where did these crystals come from? And never mind that.
Tsukinawa gulped, pointing toward the daisies. Next to him, Izayoi was still passed out, and Zangetsu was splayed against the wall, his chin tucked to his chest.
We've got company.
Edge forced himself through a nauseating wave of pain to twist his body to face the rear of the chamber. A pair of shadows were rising from the crystal remnants that had bounced down the stairs of each dais during the explosion. At first, they were watery, dusky wisps, like smoke rising from a collective of extinguished candles at an altar. But little by little, human features began to fill in, breaking through the drab of grey and taking on a pale, sickly sheen as flesh formed and limbs lengthened. Edge's heart sank to the pit of his stomach as an upsurge of warm, tingling nostalgia ignited his every nerve ending. These shapes were so familiar. He could practically smell the divine mix of match-scented perfume and mink stole that would embrace him every time he pressed his cheek to her chest, and recall the trace of every raised line on the calluses of his hands as they gripped his own, their size dwarfing his own even as a grown man.
Oh, come on.
Edge felt the sting of his tears only after they had begun to fall down his cheek, his throat clenching.
You have got to be kidding me.
Gekao was staring ahead, utterly dumbfounded at the scene unfurling before him. Tsukinawa was frozen on his knees, his stare bouncing between Edge, Gekao, and the towering figures that were now gingerly stepping down the dais steps, a pair of dazzling bejeweled crowns resting upon their heads.
Is the enemy trying to confuse me?
Tsukinawa muttered, mostly to himself.
These two look so familiar.
Gekao turned to Tsukinawa, his face collapsing in a desolate frown.
Tsukinawa. Those two are. were.
Edge lowered his head, suppressing a rising sob as the red-haired woman clutched his chin in her lacquered hand, her fingernails extending into his flesh by a couple of millimeters, their growth stopping just short enough to brand him with crescent moon-shaped markings as she forced him to look into her hollow eyes. Behind her, the silver-haired man tilted his head, his mouth in a flat line as dead, lightless orbs bored hungrily into Edge's fallen form. Edge slowly reached up to press his hand over the woman's, her flesh as cold as diamond dust. Even with you standing before me, I still can't remember your voices anymore. No matter how hard I try to recall, it's all lost to me now. Before you kill me, please, at least say my name one last time, so that I can take my memories of you in full whenever it is I end up. He felt another tear slide down his cheek, and the woman grimaced as it splashed her fingers, snatching her claws back as if she had been burned.
Mom. Dad.
End of chapter.